Welcome. How's it going? I came across this, which was a conversation between Coleman Hughes, who studies at, I want to say Columbia. It's a Ivy League school, I'm pretty sure, maybe Harvard. And he's written for, what's that one? Quillion? No, that I'm thinking of Quillium, which is the anti-terrorist thing. It's Quillette, the best a bleep can get. And he is, I don't know where he is politically. I think he's on the left somewhere, but he's smart and he's um, off the rails a little bit in the black community because he doesn't agree with them. So this conversation will be interesting. It's framed as, will the push for reparations get Trump reelected? So they're both against Trump, but it's not. It's not like are reparations good or bad. I'm sure they'll get into that. But I would assume, I think Coleman Hughes put an article out where he's against reparations, thinks that they don't make sense, wouldn't work, and are kind of an insult. Whereas Sam Harris is on record saying that he's in favor or he's open to the idea, at least. So I have not heard any of this. I'm going to grab the chat, and I'm actually delaying going to the gym. So that's a little inside baseball. That's breaking the fourth wall there. I should be going, but maybe we'll see how far we get into this. See if it's interesting. I mean, it has to be. These two guys, I like them individually, so I'm going to like it. And this is a new channel, Coleman Hughes, 455 subs. I will sub it. I will get the notifications. You should do that on my channel. Is Sam in a funeral home? Okay. So Sam has recently taken mushrooms and shit, and I'm not sure where his brain chemistry is at right now, but
Welcome to Conversations with Coleman. My guest today is Sam Harris, neuroscientist, author of The End of Faith, Waking Up, The Moral Landscape, Free Will, Lying.
let's analyze. I'm a visual guy. That is lube. That's a jar of lube. I would spot that from a mile away. Looks like a cramped environment that he's in. It looks like a student dorm, actually. Yeah, this is a student housing type scenario. We got a gorilla. That's overtly racist. Okay.
Podcaster extraordinaire and
Guess he
one of
sold
my
his
personal
ass at
heroes.
the beginning.
Thank you for being on the show, Sam.
Oh, well, thanks for jumping into this. It's great to, you are one of my personal heroes now as well.
Okay, laying it out a little bit thick. Uh, a man into his 40s should not have heroes in their 20s, especially their early 20s, unless it's college football and they just won you a large bet. Sam, dressed all in black, kind of like, reminds me of Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi when he comes back and he's like all gangstered out and he's fully um, trained up in the Force.
As you may know. So, yeah, I'm happy to inaugurate your podcast. I don't know how many episodes you've done. How deep are you into the recording at this point?
You're my third,
Uh-huh.
but I'm
Cool.
probably going
All
to
right.
release you first.
All right. Well, happy to be here.
He's
Yeah.
using you, Sam, for your name.
So I was thinking we would start off by talking about reparations, if that's okay with you.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't. This is a topic.
Yeah, a topic you've avoided for years. I mean, Sam was so tentative to even get into race at all. And he's always conscious of optics. So he's worried about his career, his reputation. I'm sure his wife is in his ear and saying, look, why take these risks? That's why he's not talking reparations with me or Stefan Molyneux or anyone like that. Why? Strictly because we're white. I mean, Coleman Hughes probably thinks the same the way I do about reparations, but because he's a young black male, Sam feels like, oh, I'm safe. I can actually sit here and talk. I mean, he's done this before, by the way, multiple times. So if he wants to talk about Islam, oh, bring on a Muslim, Majid Nawaz, Sarah Hayder, Ayan, Hirsi Ali. And then he hides behind them and their identity. So Sam doesn't really have mastery over the jujitsu involved in identity politics. He plays the game.
That I think is genuinely difficult, about which I don't have a settled opinion. So my mind is unusually open on this topic.
Yeah, and my mind is, I think, more open than you would expect it to be. I've evolved in my thinking on this issue even in the past 2-3 weeks. Just
What? That's a young person's statement. I've evolved in my thinking over the past 2-3 weeks. That represents like 2% of his life.
having had so much time to think about it, having gotten so much feedback. Um, so, obviously, I think my fans will know that I testified before
Did he say obviously? Could you? Maybe I'm saying it wrong my whole life. I don't pronounce the B in obviously. I treat it like it's not there. Are you with me on that? Because I know Steve Shives goes hard on the B. He's dropping hard B's on that all the time, and I don't know. I always thought it was a silent B. What the fuck?
Congress a few weeks ago against reparations. I was one of 8 testifying. You can see the video on YouTube, and testifying for reparations for Bill H.R. 40 was
Right. He testified against reparations in Congress. So it's for him to say he's evolved in his position is kind of ridiculous. But I'm more interested in. I mean, reparations. We could just put a bow around that. It's a ridiculous idea, completely immoral. Um, it's not practical. It's impossible to implement. But on top of it, it's an evil thing to do. It's a racist thing. You're talking about resources and money that will affect humans' lives today. It's our money. It's not just they don't grow it on trees and like here you go. And just the idea that you'd give money to one race in your country. I mean, God, what a colossal mistake that would be. I mean, I don't even the ramifications of that. Wow.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, Danny Glover, and many others, and then it was myself and one other person testifying against, and that went pretty viral. I think that went more viral than anything that I've said or written,
Right.
and a lot of the backlash was pretty ugly. It was, a public shaming of a degree that I haven't really experienced before, and I want to talk about public shaming in general
Oh, you came to the right place. Sam has gone through it.
later because you're a veteran of that territory.
Yes.
But
Having been shamed.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think we should talk about reparations first.
And it's interesting because Sam does not deserve to be shamed. He was right on everything he said about Islam, religion, you name it. He's a genius. I don't use that word lightly. The man is a genius. Coleman Hughes doesn't deserve to be shamed. He's correct about reparations. So, but it is interesting because you live your life not getting shamed, rightfully or unrightfully, by millions of people. You're not equipped for that. It's not something you learn. So when it happens to you, and it's happened to me in a minor way as well, um, it's interesting how you navigate through that. But it's not your position that's wrong. So you have to keep that in mind.
And I think you can go back and look at what I said and what I've written about it in Quillette. But I think one mistake I made
I think he should do a split screen. He's early on his YouTube career, but like we should see Sam's reaction, but he doesn't have it set up like that.
was, I guess, trying to think about reparations with the logical half of my brain more than the emotional half, because I think, I think, you know, slavery and Jim Crow
Oh.
for many people just feel like an open wound. Feels like just something as a nation we have not yet gotten closure about.
Well, whose fault is that? It takes one to tango here. So if you're in a relationship and one person has a hang up on one thing, it's not us. So don't say we as a nation. I'm over it. I'm over slavery, just like I'm over the bubonic plague. I'm over the smallpox epidemic of 1775. I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about a psychosis, a problem like a mental illness that affects just a huge percentage of people. And I think it goes to what Yang says about people and their happiness level when it comes to their wealth. If you don't have money, you start bitching. Why are most marriages, why do they end? It's always strain that comes from economics, money. Couples that have a bunch of money, they tend not to get divorced because they're like, well, we're happy. Things are floating. Floating? No, things are flowing. And so if the bleeps were doing better as a group, I think that they would not look to the government for handouts. I mean, it kind of makes sense.
And we can
Mm.
talk about why that is, but that just is a fact, I think, at this moment. And the goal that I completely share with
Well, also, here's a greater fact is that there are many blacks in the 70s, 80s, 90s. and even the early 2000s that were not obsessed with this and with the grievances of slavery, which they didn't experience. And I mean, this is all theater. The fact that they pretend that they are wounded by this, like he says, it's an open wound, is a joke. It's a scam. This is it's just a viral talking point that they all buy into, and it's brought about by social media. These people were not doing this 10, 20, 30 years ago. They were worried about their careers and the real world. They were not psychologically trapped 150 years ago. So this is partly a marketing problem.
With people who want reparations is to feel like slavery and Jim Crow are somewhat closed wounds, that the scar is healing nicely, so to speak. The question is, how do we get there? And I want your opinion on this. Do you see that as the goal, and do you see reparations? If so, do you see reparations as a way to get there?
Well, again, with the caveat that I haven't thought a lot about this,
That's bullshit. He's been saying I haven't thought a lot about this for a year now.
and I really have.
He says that because he knows it's a toxic position, and all Glenn Greenwald and all his haters are studying this, and they're looking for what did he say about reparations? What did he say? Did he say no? Because if he says no, there's going to be articles coming out, and it's going to be shame Sam Harris. He's against blacks.
I do not have a settled opinion on it.
Mm.
It seems to me that there's a fairly straightforward ethical case
And he's going to bring it to the Holocaust and the Jews. So as a Jew, they somehow relate this, and the comparison is very odd. But let's see how he frames it.
for it. I mean, there's this obvious injury that you can bound historically in at least to a first approximation, and you can link it up with a fairly obvious debt. I mean, you can make some argument about the amount of wealth that was created, and we have the history of wealth inequality that followed. It's something. It's not nearly as clean as a more contemporaneous injury, like you're paying reparations for Holocaust survivors in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, say. But it still is. It's fairly easy to pinpoint the moral problem. I think it's very hard to make a practical case for it, and I think it's impossible at the moment to make a compelling political case for it. I mean, just to take
That's reasonable. So yeah, I mean, I will grant that if we are talking about living memory, if we're talking about one generation removed from slavery, and you say, wait, can we get compensation for the work we did? You know, slavery was a evil institution, and we've been wronged all these years, and we have nothing to show for it. Then yeah, they should have been. And it's rightly pointed out that the slave owners were given reparations for losing their slaves, essentially, because it was considered property. So you couldn't just come in and take someone's livelihood. And I'm not sure what the slaves actually got outside of once they had their freedom, if they had any rights or any sort of, even prisoners get some like a per diem or some pocket change, don't they, when they get thrown out of jail? But the point is, it was whatever it was nowhere near what it should have been. So if we're in that time period, but again, time is such a huge factor here. It is enormous. Think of what time is in sports. Hey, I made the winning basket. No, you didn't. The buzzer went off. It doesn't count. Yeah, but it went in. Yeah, but no, there's rules. Like you cannot discount because it's not just time. Time is one thing. Like let's say a slave, he works for 20 years on a plantation. He gets freed, and then he lives to be 90 years old. And at 90, he goes, you know what? Finally, I got my reparations. I got paid, and he deserves it. But once you're talking about a different life, not a long period of time, another human being. Now this is that's a moral quandary. That's you can't do that. You don't get credit for what your ancestors did. You don't get reparations for slights committed against them. It just doesn't make sense because then what's the next gripe? I mean, it doesn't make sense on its own, but who wants to see the next argument? I mean, the Chinese or the Irish, what are we doing here? This is not a get-rich-quick scheme, and that's how they're playing it. And they're doing it because they're failing. And I'll be willing to say it. They're not going to say it. Well, Coleman might say it. But their personal failure, generation after generation, and it's family by family, is not our fault, and it's not slavery's fault. And many people have pointed this out. Glenn Lowry, Lowry, is that his name? I think. Who am I thinking of? There's a point guard named Lowry. Plays for the Clippers, doesn't? Fucking. All right. He's a black. Um, but what he said is, look, why is it that every other group does well immediately within one generation? Whatever turmoil, whatever challenges, they overcome it, they get it done. And why are we pretending like somehow slavery from 150 years ago is this anchor that is stopping this community from excelling? We're ignoring the elephants in the room, and we'll see if they do that in this conversation. We're 4 minutes in.
Take the immediate concern of the next presidential election. My gut intuition
Oh, there he is up on the top right. I see you, Coleman.
is that pushing for reparations now for among the Democrats is just
Yeah,
a guaranteed way to get Trump elected for 4 more years.
agreed.
I think it's a political non-starter that's not going to prevent certain Democrats from attempting it. But so even if at the end of a long conversation, I could say I'm for reparations. I'm not for reparations in this election cycle, just because I think it will guarantee Trump. So that's the. So I think those are
And
separate.
the translation of what he's saying is he's talking literally about a guy like me. I would not vote for a Democrat who is in favor of reparations. I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And I'd be shooting myself in the foot because all the other issues, but it would really bother me. Like I could not get behind someone. And what it says to me about who they are, for them to be that wrong on such an easy issue, it tells me they're not capable of leadership. They're unfit for the job. So if you lose Democrats like me, you're absolutely fucked. There are pussies out there, these centrist scum and these low intelligent sort of chud incel bitches out there. They'll vote for whoever. They're just like, oh, let's watch it all burn down. Like Sargon or whoever fucking idiots. Like, you know, they'll just float over to whatever side is. Let's own the libs, whoever the fucking far left is, disregarding the fact that obviously there's more than two political parties in America. It might show blue and red, Republican, Democrat. There's like 10 different parties in there. Okay, as far as obvious distinctions within the parties. So I am clearly not aligned with TYT and the far left and all that shit that they do. But this is an issue, reparations, and I think issue by issue is way more important than just blind tribal allegiance, political tribalism, because it gets to the heart of the issue. If you are in favor of reparations, I'm not in favor of you, and I'm not voting for you.
Pieces. As far as yeah, I mean, it's just the ethical case is pretty clear. It's just the issue.
Wait a minute. I mean, again, time is of significance here. So we need to find a baseline. What event in history is too far to go back to ask for money for? Anyone? The shit that happened in the 1700s? Can we all safely say that if you have a gripe from the 1700s, you're not getting money in 2020? It's insane. At that point, you might as well take a run on the banks or, just say, fuck it. I mean, there's no trust in the government. If they're going to spend your tax dollars to pay for crimes from hundreds of years ago, that does not fly. Sorry.
Issue you get into is that immediately bleeds into the practical case. I mean, who pays and who gets paid, right? And how? Like what are reparations in this case? And
Well, I'll answer it for you the way they envision it. Anyone who's black gets paid. Anyone who's half black. They'd cut it down to like, I mean, Kaepernick wants money. Um, Rachel Dolezal wants money. They all want money. Sean King wants money. And who pays? The U.S. government would pay, which is us, uh, disproportionately being paid by white people. Is That's the taxes? That's how that works.
and what are we actually correcting for? Are we correcting for the the ambient level of racism that still exists to the disadvantage of African Americans, or
It doesn't. And he must recognize, they both must recognize that it wouldn't correct for any of that. And even as a gesture to correct for that, it's insane and insulting.
are we correcting for identifiable theft of for people who are the descendants of slaves?
Well, it'd be a one size fits all. They'd try to do all of it in one fell swoop. But it wouldn't work, obviously. So, yeah, it's really disturbing that it's even being talked about. So it's already a win for the people that want reparations that we have to explain why it's a terrible idea.
And I mean, so there are many people who are black who probably inherit.
It's kind of like, remember when Ken Ham debated Bill Nye, and people told Bill Nye, don't go on a show, don't debate this young Earth creationist because you are giving undue respect to his position by even telling him he's wrong.
Who certainly inherit whatever consequential racism still exists, but they aren't descended from slaves, right? They're immigrants, or their parents were immigrants. Uh, so how you reconcile all of that? I mean, that's very difficult.
Yeah, so I like that you separate this into the ethical conversation and the practical conversation.
I have a question. What about women? Should women get reparations? I mean, women were not allowed to work. Couldn't that be seen as oppression? It has to be. So, what about all the lost wages, the lost wealth that women could have had? That to me is as rock solid a case for reparations as any. Now, when they got their rights fully, you know, put in place, I don't know when. I'm not a feminist. I'm not a historian when it comes to women's rights, but it's within generally the same time frame, if not sooner. So, I, it's just you don't hear women saying, "Give us money, give us reparations," but why not? It's interesting.
I think most supporters of reparations limit themselves to the ethical part of the conversation.
Hold on. In the background, is that Back to the Future? That font right there. It looks like some Back to the Future, doesn't it? Look. No, maybe I'm wrong.
Limit themselves to the
Some video
ethical
game shit.
part of the conversation, clearly because they have a better case there. But there have been some, like the economist.
Yeah, so the ethical case for reparations is slavery was terrible, slavery's bad, give us money. Well, you weren't slaves. Yeah, but what? Well, still give us money. We weren't slave owners, you weren't slaves. Conversation's over.
Sandy Darity, who have pretty persuasively worked out the practical side as well. He has a plan for how to determine who gets it, and he sort of worked out many of the kinks
No, he didn't.
in a way that
No, he
at
didn't.
least makes me feel, as someone who still opposes most versions of reparations, that I can't win the argument on the practicalities alone. But then there's this third part, which is political, about which I completely agree with you. I mean, I think there's something crazy about.
Well, put it this way: if you go for reparations now, and they're running out of time, but let's say they tried it, Trump will be president, guaranteed, for 4 more years. Now, let's say after that you get a Democrat into the White House, and you push for reparations. Then, let's say you get it passed, it goes through, then you're going to get a Trump, the next Trump, guaranteed in 4 years from then. So you guarantee that the pendulum swings back. It's a toxic issue, and the reason is because you're dead wrong on it. They do not deserve money.
Being blindsided by things
The slaves deserved money, not the descendants of them.
over and over again. So I was someone who was blindsided by Trump's victory, absolutely blindsided, and extremely distraught. And I think we have to learn the lesson to not do things that are going to get us blindsided again in 2020. I think reparations is clearly one of those things, given how unpopular it is.
Yeah, talking about reparations during this election cycle makes Hillary Clinton look like a red pill based groiper in comparison. And we know she clearly was not.
But I want to wind it back to the ethical conversation for a second. Clearly, if we're talking about reparations for slavery, well, let me wind it back a second. Reparations in general, I think, are owed to the specific victims of a crime, or
Mm.
something that
Correct. This is logical.
was not defined
It's like, hey, you stole money from me. Well, don't worry, we caught the thief. Okay, well, can I get my money back? Yes, he owes you that money. Okay, well, you know what? Don't worry about it, but my descendants, like my grandchild's grandchild, can you give it to him? No, we really can't. That's not how it works.
legally as a crime at the time, but we look back on with horror. So, but it's less clear to me that reparations are owed to the grandchildren, for example,
And
of
we're way past grandchildren. So we're talking about a period of time that is vast.
uh, of of a Holocaust survivor, even if that Holocaust survivor weren't paid at the time and should have been. And given that the like, what do you think of that? I think the median African American in America is like 33 years old, right? Born
Mm.
in the 80s, right? Do you observe that distinction, or do you think because it wasn't paid to my grandfather that in principle I inherit what was not given to him?
What a ridiculous concept.
Well, there just is this counterfactual case where had your grandfather had the average level of economic opportunity and wealth accrual of a white person
Yeah, and if my uncle had a vagina, he'd be my aunt. I mean, there's a lot of poor people and there's a lot of coulda, shoulda, wouldas, but you cannot make a case to the US government today about shit that happened hundreds of years ago and say, get me paid. I want a better life. I mean, if you do that, I'm telling you, I'm telling you right now, the resentment from everyone not paid by the government for whatever fucking reason, whatever bullshit spin job you put on it, they're gonna be pissed. They're gonna be pissed at the people that did get paid, resent the fuck out of them, and they're gonna be pissed at the government for having done it. There's gonna be hell to pay. Trust me, it'll be friggin' Armageddon. And what's crazy is like it's not like if these people get paid, then they're like suddenly going to be like, well, now we can get along. Now we have no more excuses. Nope, the excuse train continues, and their venom and their anger and their racism towards white people will continue like it is today, which is at record highs.
in his generation, uh, well, then there would have been more inheritance. There would have been something passed down, presumably. And if in your case it wasn't, I mean, you can draw a fairly straight line there. And again, there's the other side of the ledger always here. There
Sam, put the mushrooms down. You can draw a straight line. Yeah, you can draw all the lines you want. They don't work legally or morally. You do not get money for shit that happened to your grandparents. Grandparents! God damn, it's like an infant would realize this.
are white people, there are black people who are doing great. There are white people who are doing terribly. And because the moment you start talking about reparations, there's a demand to focus on what problem are you actually trying to solve in the present.
Yeah, and also the way he frames that, there are white people doing great, and there are black people doing terribly. Now, Sam lives in an extremely affluent neighborhood in Los Angeles. He owns millions of dollars, he owns a home. He has many revenue sources. He has best-selling books, etc. Award-winning podcast, and if it hasn't, it should. Um, he hangs around rich people. He floats in rich circles. Um, his vision of people, of white people, is just rich. They're all rich. But the problem is, there's twice as many poor whites as blacks. I mean, they're going to be pretty pissed off if their government and their tax dollars are going to one race in the country for shit that they didn't do. I mean, to not have the ability to see that coming, that's a train heading for you. If you, I mean,
Present, right? It's
Mm.
like if uh, should middle class and wealthy African Americans get reparations when you can point to uh, millions of people in other groups who are doing badly, certainly worse off than they are,
well, now it's
and
just talking about like wealth redistribution. Like, how can we make everyone happy? Let's just give them all money. The bleeps, they're acting up. Give them money. Who else? Well, the trans people are, there's a wealth gap with women too. Oh, give them money. Just give it to them. Can we just get the bitching to stop?
If you
It's a terrible
simply
idea.
looked long enough, you would find disparities in bad luck or historical contingencies that accounted for why they were doing badly. I mean, so there's an obvious question about where this stops.
Exactly. Native Americans. I mean, if you yield to the blacks on reparations, how the hell are the Native Americans not going to get a payday? And I believe they have gotten some paydays over the years, but they would say, "Oh, look, we're poor. Look at the average wealth and the this and that." And none of it's our fault. None of it's our destiny isn't even in our control. So you got to pay us. So they're going to pay everyone. And money is not just power. Money is energy. Money is life. Money is time. Money is a representation of the essence of what it is to be alive. So there's not a minor issue here.
Right? Because there's so
I've been saying that a lot in my videos. This is not a minor issue, almost to a degree that's too frequent in my estimation. It's not a minor issue.
many groups that have been treated badly. Again, not the injury is not as salient as slavery and its aftermath, but I mean the Native Americans
What?
obviously
Okay,
have
so what you have to realize is Sam Harris and I think alike. Sam Harris is from Santa Monica. I went to school in Santa Monica. I'm from the town over. We're from the same generation. Um, we both went to UCLA. We're the same human being. Okay, you have never seen us together in the same room at the same time. There's a reason.
a case.
Mm-hmm.
Like what reparations are they owed? Um, and that the history of colonialism will volunteer various cases, right? We can look at
Oh, look at what's he gonna say? Middle East. I bet he goes.
all of our misadventures the world over and ask, well, what is owed to Africa for
Oh,
the centuries of pillage there.
northern parts of northeastern Africa is considered the Middle East. So technically, I'm not wrong. Screw you.
Um, so there is a concern about where it stops, but you sort of have that concern whenever you try to right any wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's not really a knockdown argument against doing this. You can't have the perfect be the enemy of the good here.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it's a hard case for me because uh, I mean, so the politics creeps in here too, because the people who are arguing for reparations, I mean, someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates, uh, I mean, most of them, many of them, certainly Coates, I view as bad faith actors.
Mm,
I mean, they're just not honest brokers of
shots fired.
the ethical principles here, and um, you get the sense that either I mean, just imagine the world. Imagine the day after the fullest payment of reparations that's
Oh my
conceivable.
God, there'd be a mad rush on Popeyes.
Right? Then what happens? I mean, Coates certainly seems capable of saying, if you think you can buy us off with a check of that size, of any size, you've got another thing coming, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so the goalpost will move, and then you're left with the question, well, what was any of this for, right? If the wound of slavery can't be healed
Mm-hmm.
with anything as crass as whatever it would be, a $6 trillion check.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that's another concern.
Yeah. There's a lot there. So I want to wind it back to you the counterfactual. If not for slavery, Jim Crow, black people would have more wealth. I think that's a very supportable statement. I think on average, it's
Yeah,
clear that slavery, Jim Crow, especially policies like redlining.
No, redlining is the most exaggerated phenomenon. It happened for a very short amount of time in a couple areas. This is not a widespread federal policy. I mean, they just like the term. They love the term, and they know that most people don't know about the term. If you actually want to learn about redlining, it's an extremely minor event. So it's pathetic. Also, like just this whole thing of, well, I could have been richer if things in history had went a certain way. It's like, yeah, we all would have been richer. Like, my grandfather died in World War II. If he didn't die, we would be richer. Okay. Well, we got some money for his life insurance, didn't we? Didn't the military pay out something? Yeah, but it really wasn't enough. We deserve more. The Great Depression. We all will be richer if not for the Great Depression. Well, whose fault is the Great Depression? I don't know, but I'm blaming America. I'm blaming whatever you did, banking practices. Fuck it. Just give me money. Like, I don't care the argument. Just give me money. It's a shakedown.
Had a long-term effect on the median black person's wealth even in 2019. The question is how much of the wealth gap would be closed if history had gone differently.
Well, but what? Wait. This whole wealth gap. Okay. So again, the wealth gap when it comes to women and men has been gone over a million times. But this wealth gap, why is it a competition? If there's a gap, could it not just be the whites are doing great? The whites are doing great, period. It's not a gap. They're not pushing you down to rise up. So if you're not performing to the level of the whites, that's on you. Don't blame the whites for the gap. When I race Usain Bolt, I don't blame Usain Bolt for finishing first. Do I? know? So whites in other countries do great, but nobody's worried about that gap. This is just how whites do. Whites do certain way on average in most white countries. That's why white countries are at the level they're at and non-white countries are at the level they're at. So if you, I mean, just imagine where the focus is. There's a gap, but you target the people who are doing well and say, give us some of your shit. If there's a gap, why don't you do better? You people at the bottom do better. Nobody's stopping you, but they don't take ownership of or accountability of the fact that it's what they do, it's what they bring to the table that determines how well they do economically. How obvious is that?
More fairly. I tend to assume that I'm I've read a lot of Thomas Sowell and been very persuaded that disparities, indeed large disparities, are the norm rather than the exception.
Exactly. Get outside of America. You'd learn that instantly.
And often it's the case that the group that's discriminated against has more wealth than the group that discriminated against it.
Exactly. So the Jews, ever heard of anti-Semitism? Yeah, they lead the league in hate crimes perpetrated against them. They have overcome a million obstacles, and yet they do amazingly well. They do better than every other group outside of Asians, I guess. Right? So, I mean, look at the Chinese. Look at the Indians. Not the Native Americans, the Indians. They do incredible in America. So, what's their excuse? Oh, that's right. They don't need an excuse because they're doing well. And yet, if they wanted to paint the picture, they could be like, well, we deserve money because back in the day, you guys were doing this to us.
And the
Mm.
with wealth, the example I always give is that
He gives the example that um, people from the Caribbean, blacks from with Caribbean descent, do way better than non-Caribbean descent blacks.
there's a study from the early 2000s that showed the median Jewish household to
Right.
have 7 times the wealth of the median conservative Protestant household. And I think many people aren't sensitive to, many people, I think, not.
Okay, so there's a perfect example. Is that a problem with the Jews or the Protestant families? Now that includes a huge chunk of people. So it's a weird comparison when you're comparing like 200 million people to like five, or it's probably even more than that. But so you could explain why that is. But is it a problem that Jews make money and do well? No, it's not. It's congratulations to you. Is it a problem that working class white Americans don't do as well? Sure. And you could focus on that. But why are you pitting them against each other? Can't people see that this is a destructive outlook?
Naively assume that in the counterfactual everything would be the same. But
Right.
that aside, I think it's clearly true that black people would have more wealth than they do now if history had gone differently.
Obviously.
The reason that I don't I don't think of this in terms of the counterfactual so much is because I think it's kind of beside the point. I think so. For instance, if we're going to start doing counterfactual thinking, then we kind of have to do counterfactual thinking across the board, and that then you get led to very repugnant conclusions very quickly. For example, where would I be if not for slavery, quote unquote, hypothetically, right?
Mm.
I would have been born in West Africa rather than in New Jersey, right?
Right. You owe us money. The fact, yeah, they owe. So we brought them over, and now they're living a much better life than they would have in West Africa. So pay us.
Does that mean slavery was good for me?
It's the case has been made many times. I think Kanye said it.
No, I mean that's just the wrong way to think about it, in my view,
Right. Right.
because it's just, besides being a kind of icky way of reasoning, I'm not sure it's a very useful way of reasoning, and I
Well,
think
presumably
it's
you wouldn't even exist, right? I mean,
right,
it's not.
right,
It's yeah.
right,
I mean, almost nobody could say that they would. It would be everything would be the same, except they would have been born in another country, right?
right, right. But turning to this point, which is one I really agree with, and one that John McWhorter made as well, is
Bright guy, John
the
McWhorter.
goalposts are constantly shifting on the way we tell the narrative of what America has done to try to make up for slavery. When we
Right.
instituted affirmative action, which is still ongoing, giving black people a leg up in college admissions, diversity and
It's not
inclusion
fair.
programs in various sectors of the labor market. If you're a minority
Charity.
business owner, there are set aside programs that will allocate government contracts specifically for people like
They're
you,
getting babied.
giving you all of this is in the spirit of making up for the past, even though it's sometimes, we've sort of had to had to shift the rationale to diversity, because perhaps because people are uncomfortable with making the case for reparations. But even Ta-Nehisi has written in The Atlantic that the diversity rationale doesn't make that much sense to him for affirmative action. Really, what makes sense is the redress for history
Hmm.
rationale. And the reason I've kind of gotten away from the counterfactual way of thinking is, I do view this as, and also the reason why I tend to not think anymore in terms of comparisons to other examples of reparations is because I guess I'm less concerned with the principles involved and more concerned with getting to a place where this feels like a closed wound for people. And I
Yeah.
think of the analogy of a person who has experienced some terrible trauma, sometimes,
Rape.
often in childhood. We
Rape.
all have, I'm not one of these people, but, I know people who experienced a terrible trauma in childhood
Right. So if a rapist pays me as a rape victim, what amount is going to make that wound closed and everything's cool?
and really reconciled with it to the point where they're not thinking about it all the time. They've really gone through what it takes to get past it. And then I know other people who experienced a trauma and, as elderly people, still talk about it almost every day, interpret their entire lives through the lens of
Yeah,
this trauma
Vietnam vet.
that happened to them, and clearly have gotten no closure about it whatsoever. And my the difference between the first person and the second person, it's
Here's the problem, Coleman. None of these people went through trauma. Like you said, the average bleep is 33 years old. They were around for Wham and arcade games. They were not dicking around on plantations. So their trauma is their own identity. The very nature of what it is to be them, to have black skin, to be of the race that they are. That's the issue. And you're never going to get away from that. So they are their own worst enemy. This is a problem that exists only within the walls of their skull. Okay? Outside of that, no one cares. We just don't care. But you guys need to figure that out. Clearly, Coleman isn't wrestling with this, but those who are need to get over it because, I mean, think of the wasted opportunity we have to actually unite and move forward and get on to more interesting topics, like the fact that Greta Thunberg is the person of the year, Time Person of the Year. She's on the cover, and she doesn't even show tit, not even any underboob.
seems to me isn't so much about what the world did or did not give them, but much more about the way they reframed their own history. So I think
Yeah.
that I think that whenever reparations are whatever reparations means, and people are very quick to say it's not just a paycheck, it's much more. Other people will say it is a paycheck. So there's a way in which reparations is talked about, kind of like, I think of the analogy of the briefcase from Pulp Fiction, where you never get to see what's
Right.
in it, but
Right.
it's
Right.
amazing
Yeah.
and it's the best thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when whatever that is happens is paid, I do not think I think you're completely right that Coates and others will say, and not completely without reason, how dare you put a dollar value on
Exactly.
slavery and Jim Crow? They'll be able to muster a considerable amount of moral outrage, I think, just at the prospect of it. And I think, and frankly, I think it will be worse because I've heard from a lot of conservative fans of mine, often white conservative fans of mine, who actually do like the idea of reparations because they want to do it once and then they want to be able to say, "Damn it, you have been paid. Can you stop complaining about racism now? Can we please move on to another subject?" That's what I hear sometimes, and the
Yeah.
combination of that plus the heightened moral outrage at having slavery monetized in this way, I think is going to be a combination that makes race relations.
Well, that's why they talk about this is all done in bad faith. Ta-Nehisi Coates, that's what Sam Harris said. He comes in bad faith. It's because they make these arguments, but they just want the money, and it's not going to stop because their entire identity, or in his case, his entire grift, is centered around the fact that they're victims and that racism is everywhere and we're fighting white supremacy. When really it's just an ego trip. It's just I'm not the majority wherever I am, and you can go be if you there's black towns out there. You can be my guest. Go head over to Milwaukee or St. Louis or New Orleans. There's pretty cheap housing over there right about now, and there's a good reason for that. So you might want to second guess that. But yeah, so it's not. You got to see through that. You got to know that it's not going to solve anything. And they still haven't talked about like what did they think bleeps are going to do with the money, and do we have a track record of seeing bleeps totally misuse funds? When they get money, they misuse it. My grandfather used to talk about it all the time. um, Not to me because I barely knew the man, but I didn't know the man. But he had workers, African workers, and they would work in the mines. Well, he didn't own a mine, but he knew of this trend. And what happened was they would get paid on Friday, and then by Monday they'd have no money. They would have gone out and drank it all. They'd go out and party and just spend it all. They just did not think to save. Delayed gratification or just the saving mentality, they just didn't have it. I mean, and this is known. And so what they would do is they'd try to get it to their wives, let the wives control the finances because they would just blow it, and this would hurt them. They lived paycheck to paycheck, and it was a grind. And it doesn't have to be, but that's just the reality of that. Now, I'm not saying that all the blacks in America are like the black mine workers, but there are commonalities, obviously. I mean, they come from the same group of people, and there are tendencies. Now that might strike you as, oh no, generality. It's not all, Devin. This and that. You could be uncomfortable with that notion, even the notion of that, but it's really incredibly true. That's the problem, is that if you ask people on the ground, they'll tell you the truth of. I mean, there's tons of stuff that you're uncomfortable with that you don't want to delve into, but that doesn't mean it's not true.
Worse rather than better.
Right. Right. Well, the comparison between the two people, real or hypothetical, uh, one of whom seems totally resilient, and I mean, even in the extreme case, there are people who are clearly made stronger and more functional based on some early trauma,
Mhm.
right? Uh, and then there are people who, as you say, whose lives are just diminished by it up until their dying day. You can draw that analogy to groups and to perhaps whole cultures, right? So there are cultures, not all cultures are telling themselves stories that render them equally resilient or creative in the face of various crises, right?
Mhm.
Now, this is just a kind of generic statement, which it virtually has to be true. I mean, it's practically a tautology. If culture is doing anything to help or harm people in terms of how they function, and we have different cultures that are not, running precisely the same software, well, then you're going to see differences in that respect. Um,
Wait a minute. Why does he need to bring up the Jews now? Talking about getting over trauma. The Holocaust happens 80 years ago. The Jews are completely over it. They don't forget it. They make a point not to forget it. They grieve it. They study it. They warn people about it. They're to a fault. They're probably a little bit paranoid about Richard Spencer or whoever. Anyone who's not them, they're like, oh, the Nazis, the bad. Where are they? Where are they? But they seem to be doing fine. So how is it that the Jews could rebound so quickly and so effectively, and yet the bleeps have had what, twice as long, twice as long, 155 years to recover from actual slavery being a thing, and they haven't, because maybe it's not just economics. I mean, if that's the thing, if you throw money at it, it doesn't just solve everything, because it's a psychological issue. But the Jews today are not wrestling with the psychological trauma of the Holocaust. And again, they understand the severity of it. They respect it. They make movies. They write books. They read the books. They're aware of it. It's a very sacred thing that they are aware of this tragedy, but they're not crippled by it. Whereas with many bleeps today, it's being advertised here. What they're supposed to do is be crippled and be victims by the very fact that they were born. They're born black, and that's the problem. Because, well, blacks, not you, but blacks way back in the day had this, this, and this done to them. So therefore, you should suffer and feel the burden and the weight of the oppression from hundreds. Like, it's just the weirdest thing to teach people, and it's going to cement them and give them an excuse to never excel. So they're shooting themselves in the foot. I mean, if they can just get outside of their bullshit racist egotism for a second and realize we're trying to give you a practical solution so that you can do well. I want them to do well. I mean, when I was living in Melbourne, I was living in downtown Melbourne. There's just all sorts of Japanese, Chinese people down there, Koreans. I mean, incredible food, but it's dominated by Asian cultures in the center of a big ass city in Australia, and it's getting more and more. I was gonna say worse and worse, but it's not getting worse because for better or for worse. I mean, I don't know if they're in control of their demographics or they really envision the future of Melbourne to be like this, but it is like that. And what do? They don't commit crime. They make money. They work. They obey the law. They have their culture. So they have their food, their practices, their weird little face masks that they wear. But it's not traditional Australian what demographics. It's not white people. It's foreign, but it's not a problem. So am I rooting for them? Of course, I want them to do well. Now you could talk about immigration and demographics. It's a whole separate conversation. But the point is, any group that's not doing well, like, it's not our business. I'm not going to waste too much of my life trying to help them. But if the conversation does come up, someone should give some sober and hard hitting advice that penetrates through their shield of ego, where they just want to say, fuck you, I'm great, my people are great, we're Wakanda. And you evil fucking white devils are the only reason we're not Wakanda.
And I think we're right to worry that there is a kind of uh, religion of victimhood
Yep, that's what I was just saying.
emerging on the left, which of necessity has.
Yes, and it's stoked. So it's not just the bleeps. I'm not saying all bleeps are like this. These are percentages. We can talk about that, but it's being encouraged. It's being cheerleaded by people on the far left. So, and they have nothing to do with it. These are like middle class, like highly educated white Jewish people who want this victim narrative to be in place.
Taken in more people of color or a disproportionate number of people of color. But as you said at the beginning, uh, you know I believe you said this at the beginning. Maybe this is, I mean, this is a point that you and I are both familiar with, that the most woke people, the people who are most trumpeting this victimology are well-educated white liberals at the
Exactly.
moment.
Mhm.
See,
But
do you see how I'm inside their brains? It's weird.
there are memes now that are enshrining victimhood in a way that seems quite unhelpful.
Mhm.
And you see people who, just as you don't like to see people who are endlessly, indelibly defined by
The breakup they had in junior high.
the moments in their lives where they were victims, you don't want to see whole cultures defining themselves in.
Yeah, it's tiresome, just among everything else. Among the fact that it doesn't work, it's not going to get you anywhere. uh, unless you're Ta-Nehisi Coates and you're selling books on it and making millions.
those terms. So yeah, I think the argument for reparations would be if it if it held out a promise to actually reset this whole attitude with respect to the burden of the past.
Mm.
I mean, either we are effectively canceling the burden of the past, or
It,
we're not.
it
And
wouldn't.
if it's hopeless to even try, well then let's not, you know, open the other wounds that would be opened, or the create wounds that would be created by trying against the will of surely some considerable number of people.
Like, how much money does Brock Turner have to pay Chanel Miller to make her cool? So that they're, now we're even. Now, Brock Turner didn't do anything. He's a saint and should be the next president. But you get my point.
You know,
Yeah, it strikes me there's an analogy to apologies here, which is something I've heard you talk about more and more recently. What is an apology? Like if I'm talk if I say something to my girlfriend that really hurts her, right? And I
right?
apologize for it. I expect it if it's sincere, it gets accepted, and then I'm
Never brought up again, but girls don't do that. And he will learn that. They will bring it up and be like, I apologize for that. Like, we're over that. Right. So they're talking about good faith. They're talking about a sincere, like, yeah, I get it. It's a good point that he's bringing up.
kind of brought back to zero, right? It's like there's
Yeah,
no more, there's no she's not going to hold that against me tomorrow.
But we already know that this is all irrational because bleeps today hold against us and also whites. There are whites out there and that hold us accountable when we didn't do anything. We're not a part of this. Go learn about history. Go learn about you know how old we are. We weren't involved in this. So for us to receive any deflected rage or anger or it's completely unjustified. So that should tell you that none of this makes sense. Therefore, any proposed solution of just throwing money at this is not going to do a damn thing.
I mean, that's the idea. When it works well, that's the idea. It's like really, I
yeah,
really realized what I did wrong, and then we get to a place where we're healthy about the situation. We're both mentally healthy. We have no resentments because we went through it. We really did it. But it seems that there. I mean, one point I brought up, I think I did in my testimony, is that the Senate and the House have both did formally apologize for slavery and Jim Crow in 2008 and 2009,
Sorry.
kind of sort of under the radar. But at the time there was a black president. You might think that this was the perfect moment, in a sense, to kind of close the door. Not close the door on history in the sense of ignoring it, but
But what kind of a person would you be to take an apology from someone who didn't wrong you? You know what this reminds me of is I call up my bank and I'm like, I'm trying to figure out why this transfer of money didn't go through. And they put me on hold and I go on hold for like 10, 15 minutes. The customer service guy gets back on and he goes, "Hey, I'm sorry, Mr. Tracy, for putting on hold. I appreciate your patience." Or no, it wasn't even that. That would have been maybe he's accountable for putting me on hold. No, it was, "I'm sorry that you're having problems with your transfer." And I was like, what? Why would you be sorry? That apology meant nothing to me because you are not the cause of the problem. So why would I take your apology? What kind of an idiot would I be? To go, well, thank you. Thank you for apologizing for the thing you didn't do to me. I'm not mad at you, Mr. Customer Service Man in India.
in the sense of our emotional relationship to it.
right.
But it didn't happen, and it's not clear to me that the people demanding an apology are playing by the rules of apologies,
Yep.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also in this case, who is apologizing? So if you're
There,
talking
Mm.
about
there
reparations,
we
if you're
go.
talking about money that has to come out of the pockets of every
Tax-paying adult.
non-African American
Mm-hmm.
uh, American, uh, that is a that is a material uh, demand that is being made on people who
Did not wrong you.
were not alive during slavery or even Jim Crow, and um, many of whom don't feel at all personally culpable for what happened in the
I
past. And
wonder
the
why.
question is, why should they, right? I mean, if
Mhm.
you're talking about people who are Um,
A lot more gray hair on Sam. You notice that? Some salt and pepper action right there. It's happening. It's coming for all of us. It's unbelievable.
it's hard. You either, I mean, it's hard to know what it means to own the past as the past recedes, right? And if you can, insofar as there's an economic argument, if you can say, well, listen, you are a beneficiary of whatever this corporation is a corporation that used slave labor. We can, and now this corporation is now worth billions of dollars, and we can point to the people who lives have been made better on the basis of all this wealth. That's a material debt that, whether or not anyone alive today would have sanctioned the use of slave labor, presumably not. You still benefited from it, there's a transfer of wealth that makes moral sense here. But
No, not at all. I mean, this is just absolute lunacy. So the Civil War was fought over slavery. All sorts of people died. White people were killed. They died by the hundreds of thousands. That is a loss of wealth. I want money for that. I want reparations for the Civil War. I mean, why can't I make this argument? All of these arguments are just weak. And you know what it is? They got nothing better going on. They don't have the wherewithal to do something with their lives that's productive. So instead, they dwell in the past like total chumps.
I mean, what someone like Coates seems to want is the a vivid, epiphany on the part of every living white American that they are culpable. We are culpable
Mm,
for
yeah.
a persistent level of racism that is totally intolerable and that explains all of the inequality and is of a piece with the darkest part of our history, and that no on some level no gains have been made, and to cite any specific obvious gains. I mean, to say something, to be a white person and say, well, listen, we had a two-term black president. Just what's going to count as
Mhm.
overcoming racism? I voted for Obama twice. Uh, I gave money to his campaign.
Mm-hmm.
I was all in on the prospect of having a first black president, and then I wanted him reelected, right?
Mhm.
So is that white guy really uh, culpable for the primal sin of racism that Coates wants to redress? Um, I it's a hard case to make, but this is where all the bad faith comes in. It gets made because it's a hard case to make. It gets made dishonestly.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, there's another part to and we'll get off this
Shit.
soon. But the last part that I hear often from advocates of reparations is the idea that we have yet to acknowledge our history. That part of what is meant, if not most of what is meant by reparations, is a serious interrogation of our
Oh
past as a
God.
country. The idea being that
They want truth and reconciliation. Yeah, we're unfamiliar with what happened with slavery. No, we're bored of it. God, it's all about you guys. It's all about the bleeps. Let's talk about the bleeps and the history of the bleeps and the bleeps. Holy shit, you self-centered bastards. You motherfuckers. Let's talk about artificial intelligence, sex robots, the environment, space travel, aliens, world peace. Let's cure cancer. Let's fight poverty. Like, let's do something, you morons.
what most white people think happened is we fought a civil war, and ever since 1865, black people were roughly treated equally. And what we need to do is really correct our history and knock over all of the resistance that white people allegedly feel to honestly
No, it's
acknowledging
not
that.
resistance. It's boredom. We don't care. We know it wasn't hunky dory from 1865 on. We're aware. Go take a class in it. I mean, like I said, the Irish and the Chinese weren't treated fairly. Neither any immigrant group wasn't. So what? So what? What am I going to wake up tomorrow and dedicate? Well, how were the wages for the rail workers, the railroad workers, the Chinese? I don't care. I don't live in the fucking now. Idiots.
slavery and Jim Crow happened, and that many of the specific policies constituted like an extraction of wealth. And when I heard that, when I hear that argument, what I think to myself is, in the 10,000 years, in the 10,000 year history of slavery, slavery is as old as civilization, has been
Right.
practiced in nearly every civilization, on almost every continent, on every inhabited continent, in fact. What I think to myself is, I don't I don't I don't think there's a single example of slavery that has been more studied than American
Exactly.
slavery.
It's a great point. Coleman makes a great point, and it leads me to think about this for the first time. But why is it that in Africa, the home of slavery, I mean, not just the transatlantic slave trade, but we're talking thousands and thousands of years of the history of slavery. Why is it that those Africans today are not bitching about reparations, but good luck with those governments, but why are they not centering their life around their identity as a slave? Well, they're not slaves. Well, some of them. I mean, I know there's some slavery out there, but they're not saying, oh no, well, my grandfather's grandfather's grandfather was a slave and I need to talk about that every day and I need to study it. And oh my God, slavery wasn't that bad? Slavery. You know why they don't do it? It's because the slave owners were black. The slaves were black, the slave owners were black. And in their minds, in Africa, well, then, whatever. It doesn't even bother me. It's not a shot across the bow. It doesn't slap me in the face. It's not insulting to my identity. Because, yeah, those people were wronged. Don't get me wrong, my grandfather's grandfather's grandfather was wronged. But he was wronged by a black guy. So it was kind of a flex for the blacks. What they have a problem with is an inferiority complex. That's what it is. If you're subjugated, if you're enslaved as a group of people in the American context, you walk around with a chip on your shoulder going, you motherfuckers think you're better than me because you used to own us? And we're us, and I speak as the ambassador of white people, we're looking at them going, dude, I don't think that. I don't think I'm superior to anyone. Me personally, I happen to be superior to, pretty much everyone. But no, it's not on my mind. I'm wondering who Howard Stern interviewed. When is the next Watchmen coming out? What is Baby Yoda's name? Like, uh, what am I going to do tonight? What's for dinner? Like, I don't care, dude. I don't think about you and your fucking people, and especially the history of your people. This is not reoccurring in my mind. I don't care. I'm not a part of it. It's just unbelievable. What a waste. A colossal waste of time. Imagine the talk, the rhetoric, the money, the resources that have gone in to this whole shit show that is race relations in the past decade. And for what? Where has it gotten us aside from race riots, racial tension, division, and a bunch of just missed opportunities? It's got to come to an end. Enough is enough.
Slavery between the 17th century and 19th century. And what that suggests to me is that our
I can't believe he has a gorilla sitting above his shoulder, like it's an angel and a devil sitting on his shoulder, and he's talking about racial issues in America. It's unbelievable.
our failure to get past race is, which is a goal that not everyone shares, and we can talk about that.
Yeah, good point.
It's not going to be helped by further study of the
Yes,
past. And as
yes.
much as I like history personally,
And everyone, history should be preserved. It is sacred. It is important. But again, to center your life around it makes no sense, and it's not leading to a good goal, like he says. And I think people need to be called out. What is your objective here? Our objective as white people is to be happy, live by the golden rule, move forward, seek happiness, seek meaning. We are not trying to oppress anyone. We are not in favor of slavery. We don't care. We treat each person as an individual. Because here's a newsflash: we don't treat white people away. A lot of bleeps they view white people. They code switch and they view whites in a certain way and they sort of have their doubts. It's called racism, but that's a shorthand for you. But we don't view white people. So like, if you're a typical white person, you live in a generally white neighborhood. Many people do. There's many states like that, cities like that, neighborhoods like that. We don't go around viewing people as white people. We view them as individuals and we gather information about the individuals as they go along. Now, there are other things like young people we have certain stereotypes about, all justified. Dudes who dress like thugs, we kind of, okay. A guy with a face tat, we kind of, all right, that's a certain type of guy. I have information collected about that guy. But we're not just racially stereotyping people because everyone's white. So why don't you try? I mean, try to rise up above tribalism. Is it even possible? Do you understand the benefit of it? And that's the thing. I mean, people do what they want to do, and this whole thing, the obsession about race coming from the bleeps, it's beyond uh, just like a broken mentality. They have to be being gratified by it. It has to be scratching an itch, and it might just be the fear of not having the safety net of blaming white people for everything. Because the alternative to that is it's a rough talk. It's a talk I couldn't give you on YouTube. It's a talk I would give to Phil Anselmo in Louisiana, but you're probably not going to want to hear it. And it's just the truth of it, though. Like there are certain things that are not going to be kosher. They're not going to be to say in public. But if you actually want to solve a problem, like it's not helpful. Do you remember like my sister when I went to my first day of seventh grade? I First day of school is a big deal, and you're redefining yourself, you're rebranding yourself. And I decided to wear a pink shirt. It was a short sleeved pink shirt, and it was 80s, So I was like, it was pretty fly. And it's a bold statement. I've never really worn pink before, definitely not on the first day of school. I went out, wore pink. No one really reacted. Didn't really get many comments on it. I was kind of on the fence about it, but I thought I'd kind of nailed it. Came home, my sister, what'd she tell me? She goes, "You look like a dork. Take that off. You should never wear that again." It was harsh, but it was true. And it was, why did she say that to me? She said it to me because she loved me, and she was saying, "This pink shirt looks like ass. Do not wear it. I'm telling you that as a friend." They need some tough love that usually would come from a father, but don't even get me started with that.
And I find history to be fascinating. This idea that we need to delve deeper into the past as a primary means of sort of reconciling ourselves as
Mm.
Americans doesn't hold water for me.
Yeah, well, it's there's no end in sight if you go down that path. I would agree with that. It's again, if you have an
The only end I could imagine is fatigue, racism fatigue. I mean, who is not tired of this goddamn topic? Imagine if it's the central thing in your life. Race, race, race. White people, fucking whites, blacks and whites and whites and black. Good Lord. Oh, God. I'll tell you, here in Buenos Aires, we don't talk about black and white. We don't talk about race at all. Well, maybe they are, but I don't speak Spanish, so I don't. I have no idea what they're saying, actually. Um, in Toronto, they're not talking about it. I can tell you that. It's not being discussed in Switzerland or Australia. I mean, you'll still have far left regressives who they get the narrative, they get the talking points from online. That's the problem, though. It's not just individually sprouting up in all these places. The obsession comes from online. That's where you have to burn it out. But I mean, good luck with that.
identifiable injury that is easily bounded, right? Where you can say like, well, this is your parents did this to my parents, and here are the effects, right? Like you dumped uh, toxins on our land, and it's going to cost $1 million to clean it up, right? Like that's so like those are debts that people and even previous generations can incur to uh, others, and um, so I wouldn't want to close the door to reparations on the basis of past grievances that were formed in the past, just across the board. But again, it's just with something this big and this complex and this old, right? It's hard to see how it could ever really make moral or practical sense
Mm-hmm.
that you um, and then you're still you'll be left with the present, right? You're left with persistent inequality of various types in the present, which uh, as you point out,
I'm uncomfortable with the conflation of inequality with things that are not the same level. It's not the same. Inequality suggests that there's some nefarious thing that is in place that is disallowing one group to achieve with another. That's no. When Usain Bolt beats me in a race, it's not inequality, even though our times in the 100-yard dash are not equal. So this is a little iffy territory that Sam's going down.
in your writing, and I believe you mentioned here briefly there are all kinds of inequalities that we never think to try to remedy, right? I mean, if you go looking for group differences, if you
It's gonna go talk about height. So
look at how
so
uh, you know, Polish Americans compared to French Americans in their, economic well-being, right? You're going to find a difference,
Mhm.
yeah, so he's making the point I just made, but in his way.
right? I don't remember who's on top there, but um, you know, any group that finds itself below a significant number of other groups could say, listen, there's got to be something
wrong with the
fairly
wrong with the groups that are above me? No, it's wrong with you.
sinister that explains this, because I wake up
100%.
every day, trying to gather as much wealth as possible, uh, and as a French American, it galls me that I've got the Indians and the Nigerians and the Polish above me, right?
Mhm.
Um, no one would take that seriously, right? I mean, I presume no one would take that seriously.
Exactly.
And
It's the same thing
um,
being
what
expressed.
we want to get to a place where it makes no more sense to say that of any other group,
Mm.
right? And so the
And
question is
Sam exposing that right there is a start. Obviously, this is on a podcast with like 1,000 views, but geez.
how to get there.
Yeah, I think so. One, I was going to bring this up later, but let's do it now. So I think that I coined this term, I think, in my mind at least, racial gapology, which is
Hmm.
just the study
That's some bullshit, dude. Well, he is on record, and I did a video about this. He is the one that saw, not maybe didn't see my video, but someone on Twitter told him racism of the gaps, and he said, "Oh, that's good. I'm going to use that." And go look at his Twitter. It's back in there because it's the God of the gaps applied to racism. Of the gaps, just find a gap and just attribute it to racism. But now he's taking it a step further. So this is like the Fugees remixing Enya. I'm Enya, and he's the Fugees.
of
Right.
racial gaps. And on the left, this takes the form of studying wealth gaps between blacks and whites, etc. On the right, this sometimes takes the
And he actually wrote me and said that's a good thing. I'm going to use it.
form of studying IQ gaps between races, for example. And my sense is that all of that research, the whole category of taking one group to another,
Yep, it's
comparing some
problematic.
outcome, is something we should become less interested in.
Totally flawed.
And
Yeah.
I think, um,
Well, the thing is, the crucial thing, and this is what was so frustrating when I touched this topic.
mhm.
Like, there's just no way. It
Oh,
would be an
there's
absolute
an edit.
miracle
There's some bullshit. We've been compromised. The purge is upon us.
if you could segment the human population based on identifiable groups, that differ with respect to the genealogy, and therefore the genetic character of their ancestors. I mean, you literally have human populations that lived apart significantly for thousands and thousands of years,
Mhm.
so they're going to differ genetically. And then you have the differences of culture layered on top of that,
Mhm.
right? So you have different groups. Take, to be non-inflammatory, take the Norwegians and the Japanese, right? Or the Norwegians and the Italians, right? These are you can look at people and tell that they, didn't come from Norway or didn't come from Japan, right?
Mhm.
These people are different.
There's 539 people watching me. Holy God. That's nerve wracking. Imagine being in front of 500 people. Freak me out.
And they have different cultures, they have different languages. It would be an absolute miracle if everything we cared about were at the same mean level in those groups,
Yeah.
right? So we know we're going to find difference. And so to say that the mere discovery of difference is a sign of ethical pathology, or that it need be politically catastrophic or problematic.
Mhm.
I mean, that's just sets you up for an endless round of conflict. I mean,
Right, and he's being very polite and he's making great points, but we're pussyfooting around the basic idea, which is that the only people bitching about this are the bleeps. Like, for example, the spelling bee is always won by an Indian family. They homeschool their kids. The Indians, they freak out. They know how to spell everything. They win every year. Every once in a while, a Jewish kid will make it and win. Now, am I upset by that? Am I alarmed? Do I feel inferior? Uh, Am I willing to admit that those Indian kids can spell better than me? No, I attribute it to them. Good job, guys. You did well. Now, why am I not freaking out about that, obsessing about that, saying, oh, If only this, and this happened, I could spell better than them, those motherfuckers. It's because I am busy achieving in my life. I have projects. I have love, friendship. I have travel. I have things that are positive in nature that I'm occupying my time with. So I'm not obsessing over the fact that I'm not the best chess player. I'm not the best speller. I'm not the strongest or the youngest or the most, the best looking, whatever it is. It's all this inferiority complex. And I'm sick of like pussyfooting around and treating them with the kid gloves and saying, look, we do this all the fucking time. So you look at the bell curve and they go, oh, those damn whites, they think they're so much better than us because the bell curve study came out. The bell curve, you know what it says? It says you as the Joe White guy, average white guy. I'm here to tell you there are literally billions of people smarter than you in the world. Literally billions. Are you dealing with the trauma? Is that an open wound for you? And what does the white guy say? He goes, no, I'm cool with it. I'm still going to go to Harvard. I'm still going to do well on my corporate gig. I'm still going to try to get the yacht or whatever you're doing. I'm still going to try to pay my bills and move forward in my life and be happy. I'm not going to be consumed with guilt or jealousy over the billions of people that are just mathematically, factually smarter than you. And that's a fact. All of you can grapple with that. Why are none of you wrestling with that? Why are you not in the fetal position over the fact, and you know it's true? You know that's true. So what? So why is it that this group, this one group in particular, has just a raging inferiority complex? And then they have the gall to push that problem onto us? They project it outward like it's our superiority complex? It's clearly not. We don't care.
We will never
Go, Sam. Tell them.
get beyond this. And so the question is, what is a status quo that is actually okay, right?
Hmm.
And how do we actually identify real problems in it?
Yeah, so I feel like I agree. I agree with that completely, and I've even seen data showing IQ differences between different white ethnic groups.
Yeah,
You know, if they
exactly.
did tests
That's
in
what
the
I'm telling you.
military, and you found huge gaps sometimes between
Mm.
Irish and Poles and whatnot.
Yes.
And you know, none of this stuff is intrinsically interesting to me. I don't think it is to you either. I mean, what was interesting about that whole debacle was I don't know that you even mentioned IQ and race for 15 years in your career, right? And
No,
then
no, yeah,
some
yeah.
people were painting you as quote unquote obsessed with the topic.
It's
And so
a
I think
difference.
I agree with you that these data at the moment are very inflammatory. At least some of them are. And there are two approaches to that you might want
See,
to.
it's encouraging. See, the fact that if you've been listening to this, you know this is the first time I'm playing this. And so the thought I just expressed about whites, the differences between white IQs, and the fact that the average white person has to grapple with the fact that there's billions of people smarter than them, he just made the same point. And the fact that he was thinking of that is makes me hopeful. The fact that he had the ability to view this from another perspective, not to take this emotional knee-jerk defensive reaction of like, wait a minute, we came out on the bad side of the, and even Jared Taylor tells you like, yeah, the bell curve says that Asians and Jews are smarter than us, and like we're all dealing with it fine. So I mean, look, how hopeful should I be? It's Coleman Hughes. It's one guy, and he's a Ivy League educated dude, and he's a bright, shining star, kind of on the rise. But it's not that big of a newsflash that Sam Harris and Coleman Hughes can understand this. But the masses are dumb as shit. We know they're lemmings.
Take to that. You might say, well, we have to persuade people to understand that these differences will exist so that if they see them, they won't have they won't have this aggressive emotional reaction. I agree with that perspective, but at the same time,
Yeah,
I
and it's like how many black gangbangs on a white chick is going to take before it's like, are you satiated? Is it enough? Can you calm it down? Good lord.
think I think we should also persuade people and journalists and people who have platforms to talk less about racial
Yeah,
differences, and that
bingo.
it goes for IQ and it goes for wealth. I'm talking about
Right.
scholars on both sides of the political spectrum here because,
We don't
as you
though.
noted,
Coleman, we only react to people freaking out about it. No one cares about this. I mean, I'll take it a step further. We don't talk about racial different IQ differences, all that. We don't talk about race, dude. Decades go by, white people don't talk about race. It's only when it's brought up and shoved in our face and we're accused of being racist that we feel necessary, that we're like, wait, what? Who are you saying? Wait, how dare you? We go full Greta.
There's a 21 cent on the dollar household income gap between white Americans of Russian descent and white Americans of French descent. If that were publicized in the New York Times,
Yep.
if we talked about
Smart.
that constantly,
Yep.
it could be possible that people that
Yeah.
strongly identify with those ethnic roots, the French might think, well, what the hell is going on here? Like now I feel
Well, and the only reason it's ridiculous is because there's so many more ethnic groups in America. But if you're in a situation where there's two primary groups and it's Russians and French people, then yeah, there'd be hostilities and it would be a perfect excuse. And the people that are hyping it up are doing it for profit and for division. So even though they claim, oh no, this is we're trying to heal wounds here. We're going to heal wounds. I mean, it's absurd. You see what TYT does? Some guy somewhere in the world will drop an N bomb and they'll cover it like it's hot news. Like, did it, here we go, news story. Guy dropped an N bomb. He said, here's a clip of him saying the N bomb. He said the N bomb. I mean, there's a clip of Cenk Uygur where he was criticizing some Republican guy for saying the N word. And Cenk himself, he's trying to be jokey or he's trying to imitate the guy and how stupid he was for saying it. He himself says it like 10 times on his platform. So he's like, N word is toxic, it's terrible. So let's hyper obsess about it and talk about it, and I'll personally drop the word. It's crazy to me. That's as crazy as like rape. Rape is terrible. It's horrible. Let me show you. In fact, let me demonstrate. Let me live stream. I'll rape 10 chicks right here, and you'll see how terrible it is. I mean, look at what I'm doing. I am raping, and this is awful. Oh my God. Gotta stop doing this.
feel I'm implicated. I feel the Russians are implicated. I'm going to try to find the source of this disparity, and you have all of the social fabric, the tears in the social fabric that
They don't care about it.
are happening between blacks and whites now happening.
Well, because as they tear the social fabric, they build new niches. There's new potential for money acquisition. So, what did Tyrion Lannister say? Chaos is a ladder, or was that Littlefinger? Yeah. So he basically tries to um, start a revolution and start the two top families warring each other so that he can gain personally through it. I mean, you have to see that that's what's happening. It's not like these are good Samaritans. I mean, trust me, there's probably some people that are so stupid that they don't even know what they're doing. They don't know the damage that they're causing. Then there's some people, another group that just don't care. And then there's another group that, like Jesse Smollett or somebody who's just strictly doing it for personal gain. And yeah, these people they're out there, but it's like Darwinism, whatever works. So let's say you're engaged in something that's not exactly the most ethical practice in the world, but it makes you feel good and you make money off it. So you're like, yeah, I'm cool with it. You know, it pays the bills. They're like, people, this is your one and only life. And if you're not making good money and if you're not living the life you think you should be living, you live in a bad part of town, you live in a bad place, you can't afford the gifts this Christmas, you can't afford that trip around the world, then you'll pretty much do whatever it takes. I mean, that we know that about humans. So we cannot be surprised that we have despicable people doing whatever sensationalistic, alarmist rhetoric they can muster up to just get ahead a little bit more. Grifting motherfuckers. I mean, Dave Rubin just backpedaled off atheism to the point where he says he's not an atheist anymore. And that's strictly for money. And the joke that he's gonna evolve away from being gay is funny because it's like so close to being true. It's ridiculous. And there's just no big push for him to do that. But his political movement and his religious movement, inexcusable, and the man is one of the worst obvious examples of a profiteer that you can imagine. He's a fraud.
Between French and Russians, and it's that seems to me like only downside, right? So
Yeah.
I think whether it's
and
wealth,
no one's looking for quotas. I mean, so the context in which we're having this conversation is one where people are people on the left are imagining that unless you have equal representation of identifiable minority groups in every field, in software engineering at Google, in cardiology and medical schools, unless you have 13% African Americans there and 50-50 male female, and
except for the NFL
um,
or the NBA.
uh,
Doesn't matter.
the pie chart has to look the
That's
same no
one of
matter.
the funniest things ever. People still bitch about the NFL and the NBA when they say the owners are white, the coaches are white. Isn't that suck? Blacks are, they go, I heard the other day, the guy goes, blacks are like 90% of the NFL, and yet they make up 5% of the coaches or the owners or something, or 0% of the owners. And they go, that's wrong. As if to suggest that because the players are at 90%, the owners should be 90% black? Huh? The fuck? Such a leap of logic or a breakdown of logic. Makes no sense. But also, they completely no sell the concept that what the fuck, 90%? They're totally overrepresented. Where are the whites in the NFL? This is bullshit. I mean, but they're like, no, they were there on merit. What are you talking about? The fact that there's 90% blacks in the NFL is that's not an inequality. I mean, technically, it's the numbers aren't equal, but that's just speaking to um, the merit of the blacks that are involved in that sport. They achieved that. There's nothing wrong with that. If whites want to be in the NFL more, they should try harder. They would say that, and then the same stupid ass person, you bring that up with economics, like, oh no, because there's a history of there's echoes of trauma, and that's it's osmosis, oppression osmosis.
Matter where no matter what sort of pie you're baking, that uh, one that's a false expectation that just there's no way that's going to be achieved. We're not looking to do that with any of these other identifiable groups. Nobody is saying, listen, I think there's not enough French
Mhm.
Americans at Google,
Or
right?
I think 4 of the last 5.
And also, and I'll be Sam's anger translator, or what he should be saying is that what they're not saying but implying is that the reason that the French don't go and complain about their representation in Google is because it's not a popular narrative, because all whites are lumped together as whites. No one gives a shit about your ethnic heritage as a white person. And there is anti white bigotry in this country, a hatred and a contempt for white people. It's not it's not all any community, but it's prominent in the black community, and it's quite alarmingly prominent in the white fucking community and the Jewish community. They're overrepresented on the far left, and that's a fact. And you can go look that up, and it's not even controversial. It's not even. Put it this way: anti-white sentiment comes from the far left. That's not controversial. You agree? You with me? No one's here saying that the far right is against the whites. No one here is saying that the right is against the whites. No one is saying that the center is against the whites. And you are looking at a sane liberal Democrat. Uh, I mean, I'm in the middle of the bottom left quadrant. I am a normal Democrat. I am not against the whites, obviously. The only people against the whites are the people on the far left. They're overrepresented with Jews. You can go look at who the Jews voted for last time around. Um, I mean, do the research yourself. But that's a small part of the problem. They're overrepresented in media, so you hear about them more. But we're still talking about raw numbers, very small. But an alarming number of whites that are happy to say fuck whites, happy, and it's shocking, and it needs to be called out. I mean, I remember like 3-4 years ago, I said people are being racist toward whites, and you could go out and say that today in the public square, and people would laugh at you. But what are you talking about? But it's becoming less and less easy to ignore that this is a just an overwhelming trend. And you can look at the hate crime stats. You can look at this disgusting trend that we're seeing with people like Centoya Brown, the Central Park Five, Rodney Reed, where you rape or murder a white person and then you get out of jail and then get celebrated and then become a millionaire. That's, I mean, if you can't see that there's something psychological happening there and that that's a pattern, I mean, there's no helping you, because it's gross what's going on. We're living in ugly times. And meanwhile, we have the Watchmen coming out pretending like we're living in just on the verge of a race war, because we have just neo-Nazis running around everywhere, white supremacy groups popping up all over the place. Ridiculous nonsense. I mean, they're just trying to create boogeymen, and that's why they promote the KKK. The marketing department for the KKK are white liberal people who claim to be against racism. They do the PR for the KKK. They make them live forever. They blow them up.
Oscar-winning directors have been Mexican, which is great. Like when I hear that fact, I
Guillermo
don't
del
really
Toro.
Right.
have any emotional affect about it other than like, oh, that's interesting. There's there's something culturally that culture is producing a lot of great movie directors. And
Right.
if you're gonna look at, so like I'm a musician. If I look at who has had a huge impact on world music, completely out of proportion, you're going to be talking about black people in America. Or like I've met people
Right.
from Eastern Europe who heard Tupac for the first time and it just touched them completely, right? Like something about hip hop and that visceral art form just completely transcended borders and is, became popular in a way that many other genres of music just haven't, right? So that's a disparity of a kind. And
Right.
there are
Right.
infinitely
And it should tell you that a positive disparity, and it doesn't affect them. They're not bothered by it. And it doesn't apply. You can't apply the same arguments to a positive inequality because people are like, well, why even bother? It's a good thing. The NFL is 90% black. Who's complaining? You know, I think there's an income gap between Jay Z and myself, but I don't. There's no hashtag for that.
many of these, and I think that you know
The problem there is that if you were going to try to understand that, I mean, that has some reason for being,
mhm,
right? I mean, obviously black culture has made a disproportionate contribution to music,
mhm.
right, in the U.S. and therefore worldwide. So how do you explain that? Well, I think the temptation on the left would be to just say that even to try to understand that it's either on some level it's a consequence of racism, or
What?
you would have to be racist to be interested in why that would be the case, right? Or it's synonymous with other opportunities having been closed to
Mm.
Well,
African.
that's partly true. I mean, if you talk about like a sport like boxing, a lot of boxers come up, they're low class, they're working class, they don't have other things going on in their life. Boxers box because I mean, Mike Tyson was arrested like 100 times before he found a gym. I mean, he was a complete thug, no guidance. And so, yeah, I mean, there are certain economic reasons why they might be disproportionate with boxing, not just the fast twitch muscle and all that, and why they're underrepresented in things like hockey or skiing. Well, part of it's straight up climate, and then also skiing is very expensive, and so yeah, there are reasons like that. But they're onto a good point.
Americans. And there may be some truth to that, and there may be some truth to that in with respect to any minority group that has a disproportionate level of success in one area. But I think, I mean, I'm struck by your comment that many people don't think we should want to get to a post-racial society,
Mhm.
because that seems to me to be the only firm ground here. That
Yeah.
we, I mean, the only harbor we're going to find ethically and politically is to eventually
Yeah,
get to a place where the color of a person's skin is deeply uninteresting. I mean,
yeah, that's a great point. And I would equate it to how uninteresting it is, or inconsequential, or just emotionally neutral it is for white people in America or Canada to talk about their heritage, their white heritage. So if I meet a white person, I say, I'm from England for 1,000 years, Ireland, Scotland. That's my heritage. And they say, oh, that's interesting. I'm from Spain. I'm from Italy. What happens next? All it is a tidbit of information. It doesn't say much about the person. I don't, it's kind of neither here nor there. Historically interesting, maybe personally significant, but what am I supposed to do with that? I don't hate them. I don't carry grudges. I'm just like, oh, okay. I might do a follow up question. Hey, did you go and visit the old country? Or hey, you like the meatballs? Whatever. Uh, but think of that. Think of how white people just have completely, and it didn't always used to be like that. That's the thing. If you were Irish, it's like we don't serve Irish. Get the fuck out. You're not us. You're either native. You're a native. Well, I was gonna say Native American, but I'm talking about in the gangs of New York context. You had the natives. You had Bill the Butcher, and then you had the foreigners. Now they're all white, but it was a difference that mattered to them. And look at Northern Ireland. I mean, those differences are religious in nature, but also cultural, and they're powerful. But we need to erode those. We need to whittle those down, and it's not the whites aren't the one with the burden. They like to put the burden on the whites, like it's our fault. We got to lead the dance. No, the blacks, you got to catch up. Okay, we have no issue with anyone. Not with blacks, not with Asians, not with Jews, not with anybody. Now, I'm speaking as a normal white person, not the fucking, idiots out there who are fractional but still exist. What I'm saying is, what Sam is saying here is it's a big, lofty goal. And how to get there, I think first to talk about it. I mean, putting a focus on it, getting our minds to even reflect upon that as a goal, as a task, to spot people who are not doing that, clearly not going that direction. Sean King, Tariq Nasheed, whoever. I mean, we need to just accumulate more people who are aware that that needs to be the goal.
No more interesting than the color of their hair,
Mm.
right? So like it's just no one's saying, well, listen, I don't think there are enough blonde people at Google,
Yeah,
right, or working in
they're not even
STEM
counting it. They
fields
don't
now.
care.
It's just no one would think that to ask the question, and if you and it actually could be true that
Yeah, blondes are
if
underrepresented at
you
Google.
compared the
They probably are.
proportion of blonde people or redheaded people, it'd be easier to do, um, in society with their representation in any specific field, you'd find some anomaly. You'd find over and under representation, and uh,
And it's funny, I can hear the voice of the regressive responding to this, and they'd be like, no, Sam, the reason why that analogy doesn't work is because blondes and redheads have not been historically, systemically oppressed. There was slavery. The redheads weren't enslaved. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but it's just a noun verb slavery. They just got to get to slavery. And they think, oh, that's such solid ground. If I could just say slavery bad and let me condemn anyone about slavery, even though no one's in favor of it, it they just derail. And because they're coming from bad faith. And I literally can hear them say that.
presumably you could tell some victimhood narrative around that,
Mm-hmm.
or some uh, something which would seem politically uh, problematic. We have to get, just as no one would, I would presume no one would be tempted to do that today, right?
Mm-hmm.
It would have to seem just as fatuous. I mean, if we actually arrive at the future, I think we want to
When was the last time you used fatuous in a sentence? Spoken aloud in public. Fatuous. I don't think I ever have my whole life. Fatuous. I don't think I've written that. Count on Sam Harris to just drop fatuous on us. I have no idea. I mean, I gotta look it up.
live in. It will seem just as fatuous to do that with
Oh,
respect to
doubled up.
skin color or the ancestry of one's parents or anything else.
Yeah, so I want to come back to the post-racial point in a moment, but very briefly, I think people tell very convenient post hoc stories about why black people are so successful at music, for example. It's
Mm-hmm.
not that the music industry wasn't racist. The music industry was absolutely racist.
No, it's
The
capitalistic.
NBA was racist before black people got to it. It was far more a story, in my opinion, of black people not being denied on the basis of undeniable skill. If you're
Right.
talking about musical
Right.
achievement, there's just like the racism could not.
Yeah, but they're not being denied in school or in housing or in the acquisition of money today, field after field, and yet they are falling short on all these things. So I'll grant you the NBA. I'll grant you basketball. It's deeply entrenched in their culture, although there's a lot of good white players in the league right now. But yeah, I mean, if you're going to say, oh, they do well in music and sports, okay, yeah, there's a percentage of them that do. So, I mean, again, we're talking about the non-problem here. But okay, he might have a point.
It was met with so much opposition in the form of talent that it became
Yeah.
obvious to people. It's a matter
Yeah.
of human capital. Rather, I think people tell stories that are very convenient to preserve the narrative that to have their cake and eat it too. To celebrate black people where
Mm-hmm.
black people have achieved far more than almost any other ethnicity, and preserve the narrative that racism is ever present, and or somehow racism is still the cause of both success and failure. I think that's I don't
Well,
read
yeah.
history in that
Cut to Colin Kaepernick, who's making tens of millions of dollars bitching about racism.
way. But I want to come back to this point of post-racial or colorblind, because these two words, it seems to me, right now, they're under attack. They've been under attack for decades. They
Yeah,
they really need a
I would say racially neutral. Like I don't say blind because that's ignorance. I mean, we are aware of race. We are aware of reality. But yeah, it's not a good framing.
kind of PR campaign, it seems to me,
Mm,
because they have a terrible image right now. Like, Bernie Sanders a few months ago said something like, at this point we should be looking at a politician's policies and skills rather than their skin color. Which to me, if you disagree with that statement, I almost don't even know what to think of.
yeah, yeah,
Like, but 50 years ago he would have been lauded as progressive because he was essentially quoting Martin Luther
Yeah,
King.
exactly.
right.
What happened in 2019 is that he was mocked the next
Hmm.
night by Stephen Colbert, right? Hardly
Oh my
like
God.
a pink hair
Right.
Savage.
I
SJW
missed that.
type, right? Like
Yeah.
Wow.
he was
Uh,
mocked for being an old white guy expressing this colorblind ethic. And
yeah.
I think
It's
that
insane.
the fact that that's the point we've come that to say something like I try to treat people, not on the basis of skin but on the content of character,
Hmm.
immediately marks you as naive. It's like
Yeah.
you don't get it.
Right, and that's why they try to rebrand Martin Luther King as no, he was actually a real radical. And if you take this quote out of context, and even though he was talking about the 50s and the 60s, he was hating on white people, and he was, well, he was more like Malcolm X. It's like everyone's shifting over. It's incredible. I mean, we can't even all these good-willed people, these good-intentioned people who get behind the sentiment behind Martin Luther King about like, can't we all get along? Right, that's Rodney King, but the idea that let's have the children mixed together and hold hands, and we can all bond and just be happy together and judge people on their character. I mean, these are some basic concepts, really not hard to figure out, and that is controversial today. That is an alarming thing, and I was unaware that Stephen Colbert was on that, but I mean, he's kind of an idiot too. He's a Catholic.
That is crazy to me because most of the arguments against colorblindness are either complete caricatures or straw men or just non sequiturs. So like there's the notion that if you are, if colorblindness is a way of ignoring racial injustice, for example, this is something that
What?
gets said.
What injustice?
Something like, I am black, I will be treated as if I'm black, I will be treated in a different way. Therefore, you can't ask me to be colorblind. You can't ask me to view my race as a trivial part of my identity because other people won't.
Yeah,
The thing is that
but
that
they're the guardians of it. They're the gatekeepers of that mentality. They don't realize that everyone else is just beyond it. They don't want it to be the thing. They just, I mean, it's weird. Change comes slow. People just grip onto these ways of thinking.
that just is a non sequitur. Like we know there are so many ways in which you are treated differently based on your appearance, right? Like
Right.
you will treat tall people as more competent than short people. There are
Yeah.
a
Well,
million.
actually a great
It's a good
example.
metaphor.
It never occurs to me to say this, but um, being short is a serious disadvantage. I mean, especially if you're a man, right? So like
Yes,
like what it, if you're I don't
it,
know where the line is,
it's
but
great. It's great on an airplane in
yeah,
coach, but
yeah.
on a
No, but
date, on a
there
first
are
date,
not
it's
many.
not.
I mean, if you actually just poll women on their bias, the variables that concern them, I mean, people have done these experiments where it's just like how much more money you need to earn to compensate for each inch below whatever it is, 5'6". Um, it's crazy,
Right.
yeah, so that
But it
that is
doesn't
a
follow. It doesn't follow that you should, or that I should, as a short person, view my shortness as an important part of my identity. It just doesn't follow.
no, no, no. I mean, you just and there's no group of people telling you every day that this has to be core to how you view every moment of dissatisfaction in your life, right?
Hmm.
So everything that goes wrong between you and another person is very likely the result of their
Shortism.
bias against your height, right? In the future, and you could definitely. There's no question you could tune that framework up so that it
Hmm.
would always be there,
Mm.
and
And
you
I'm
would
sure there
just
are
be
some the people in the incel community probably that do that.
yeah. But there's
I'd imagine.
no or or being ugly, right? I
Yeah.
mean, like it's just if you have radically asymmetrical, facial features, right? There is no culture, there's no society, there's no group of people who think that's an ideal of beauty,
Hmm.
right? I mean, it's just not, right? It's a so you're unlucky. I mean, being beautiful is an advantage. There's
Yeah, I mean, fat people do this. You always hear fat people complain, or fat women typically, but and they say like, yeah, I'm being judged and it's not fair and people should be attracted to me. And even trans people will say, oh, you need to be attracted to me. And if you're not, then you're transphobic and there's something wrong with you. So yeah, people take that victimhood thing everywhere and they're not willing to give a fair look at their situation and detach their personal interest in having things unfold their way.
just no question, and
Right.
it is a transcultural advantage,
And
right?
it just doesn't follow from how people see you that you have to see yourself that way. That's just, but yeah,
Right,
that is one of the most common attacks on colorblindness.
and there's no uh, group that is militating that you need to frame everything but with respect to this variable,
Hmm.
right? So,
Hmm.
and there could be. I mean, you could
Hmm.
easily imagine um, people getting together saying, "Listen, this has been intolerable. This I've been a victim of this my whole life. And there are millions of people like me, and we need to deal with this, right?" So there's just there's enough human difference uh, that you can't compensate for that is consequential. And the truth is, any given individual is just whoever they are, right? You have whatever luck you have, right? And it's true that certain things set you up to succeed more or less effortlessly, and other things will require you to work with what is inarguably a disadvantage given the society you're in. And um, you can spend all your time, and yeah, it's not to say that there aren't norms in a society that we should want to change. I mean, yeah, clearly there are norms we want to change, or attitudes that uh, we want to push back against. But the reality is that even if we just scrubbed our politics and our institutions and our social norms of anything that looked like a kind of indefensible bias, you would still have bias,
Hmm.
right? You would still have people based on their evolved preferences and their cultural preferences that you can't help but form,
Mm.
who are more attracted to some people than other people, right? And so that's already an inequality that's just you could complain about. You would still have a range. You'll have a bell curve of talents over any conceivable talent, right? Um, Whether you can quantify it or not, you'll recognize that some people are better at certain things than others. Again, I was speaking about individuals, um, and you as an individual don't the fact that you might be part of some identifiable group that has a mean sense of humor on the sense of humor scale at 7, right? And some other group gets a mean of 4, right? I mean, if you have one group that has a mean sense of humor on some sense of humor scale we could come up with of 7, and you have another group that has a mean sense of humor of 4, and you happen to be in the group that gets a mean of 7, that doesn't mean that you're funny, right? I mean, you are as funny as you are,
Hmm.
right? And you never derive a real group benefit or disadvantage. It's provided you're
Yeah, he's getting down to it's groups versus individual and how you view yourself and how petty and ridiculous it is to just pit one large group of just loose affiliation. Just it's really non-existent. It's just a structure. That's a social construct that these people have come up with, and it's not beneficial. It causes harm and it just wastes everyone's time. It's aggravating actually, and maybe it's inbred in us and it's part of human nature. But now I'm gonna stop here. That's about halfway done, and it's raining outside. But I was gonna go outside, gonna go visit the GF and do a few other things. But I'm happy to dive into that. It's an interesting conversation, and I appreciate you guys swinging by. I'll hit it up later.